I have a question for everyone. What can Isaac Newton teach us about the monetary system and the possible future of gold? I'm going to provide you with my thoughts over the next few minutes, but I'd be interested in hearing yours in the comments. In this short series, I'm going to make another approach at developing the idea of the special link between physical Federal Reserve notes and gold, which I believe is the key to understanding gold's price. But first, a little background on Sir Isaac. Isaac Newton is famous primarily for his contributions in the area of science and mathematics. At least he's the one that got credited for them. Sir Isaac introduced the idea of the calculus, which is a branch of mathematics that deals with curvature and infinitesimal change. There is some controversy over who should get the credit for calculus because around the same time that Isaac Newton was working on it, a German named Gottfried Leibniz published a paper on the topic. In fact, he was first to publish. Newton supporters accused Leibniz of stealing Newton's unpublished works. Why Newton didn't publish if he was so far along in his work escapes my understanding. Eventually, the Royal Society decided in Newton's favor. No surprise, I suppose, since Newton was a member of the Royal Society. In any event, Newton now gets the credit for inventing calculus. Many people think that Newton worked on calculus to advance his work in the physical sciences, but I personally believe it had more to do with his interest in understanding the mathematics of compounding in the money lending business. But I digress. He also developed an interesting method of approximating complicated functions with sums of other simpler functions. Again, this is useful in the physical sciences, but just as useful in the monetary lending business. Speaking of the physical sciences, Newton is credited with making several contributions. There are the three laws of motion. First, an object at rest will remain at rest, and an object in motion will tend to stay in motion unless acted on by an external force. That's the law of inertia. The second, the law of force and acceleration, states that the force required to accelerate an object is proportional to its mass. Third, the aptly named law of action and reaction states that for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. Other contributions to the physical sciences include the development of laws of gravitation and a better understanding about how light behaves. Now, Isaac was an interesting character. Like many gentlemen who had enough leisure time to make advances in science, he was a man of means and he had influence, which is a polite way of saying he was kind of like an oligarch. He was appointed Master of the Mint in 1699, which entitled him to a cut of that organization's profits. But as crafty and influential as Newton was, he still fell prey to the South Sea Company stock bubble in the early 1720s, a situation that initially made him money, but eventually caused him to lose a large sum. And now you're probably thinking to yourself, okay, Paul, enough with the history lesson. You teased us about gold and physical Federal Reserve notes. Get to the point. Geez, people, give me a chance to wax poetic, won't you? I mean, this is my channel after all. I'll get to it, but with all things that become obvious in hindsight, it takes time to see it, and sometimes it has to be seen from many different angles. It's like turning a gem. If you spend the time to do so, you'll be amazed at what you can observe. So let's continue to turn this gem together. Back to my poetic analogy and Newton. Newton's law of inertia states that an object at rest will remain at rest unless an external force acts upon it, and an object in motion will continue to move with a constant velocity unless an external force acts on it. There are lots of insights that one can draw from this about how objects move, but I think there is a much broader meaning here. It applies to people too, don't you think? How many people plod along in life, preferring the comfort of their daily routine to the discomfort of change, until something happens that makes the pain associated with maintaining the status quo much greater than the pain of changing? Gamblers and alcoholics are known to hit what's called rock bottom before they feel sufficient motivation to change their ways. Some people will continue to borrow and spend recklessly until one day, usually after a bankruptcy or two, they decide that it's time to change their relationship with money and spending. Some people will have to develop a severe health problem before introducing a regimen of healthy eating and exercise into their daily routines. You get the point. So people, like objects, also tend to stay at rest or stay in motion unless acted upon by an external force. It's inertia. Sometimes we all just need a nudge. And what's true for people is also true for organizations. Organizations, after all, are made up of people, and the U.S. government itself is an organization made up of people. Now, I use the word people here loosely. They're not people like you and me. They're more like Sir Isaac here than people who have to work for a living. But I digress. Does the government require external force in order to change? Oh, you bet it does, and a lot of it. That's a whole lot of inertia right there. Now, how does this have to do with the relationship between physical Federal Reserve notes and gold? I think we can agree that the status quo represents tremendous inertia. The government would like to continue operating as it has, and will continue to do so, unless an external force shows up that changes the velocity of this gargantuan mass. In order to understand what that external force and its effects might be, let's talk about the status quo that this government would like very much to maintain. Here are a couple of illustrations, courtesy of the Congressional Budget Office. I could have generated my own graphics with current year numbers, but my own lazy inertia is telling me that copying what's already available is easier than creating something new that won't add much value. An object at rest tends to stay at rest, right? Anyway, the upper right-hand corner summarizes total government outlays in the year 2023. Outlays are a fancy way of saying this is how much our drunken sailors in the government are spending. All in all, it's about $6.1 trillion, or more accurately, it's 6.1 trillion Federal Reserve notes, which is about 22% of U.S. gross domestic product. The spending falls into several categories, some mandatory and some considered discretionary. But try taking away some of that quote-unquote discretionary spending, and you're going to hear howls and protests from various special interest groups. They have their own inertia, after all. The chart to the lower left shows deficits as a percentage of gross domestic product. It's the gap that exists between what is spent and what is brought in via taxes, and it's not a pretty picture. Over the past 5 decades, the government has had to borrow just shy of 5% of gross domestic product to cover its spending. Why does it borrow instead of tax? Well, if it were to increase taxes to cover its spending, then the taxpayers would howl in protest, and might even go so far as to decide to pull different levers in the voting booth. So it seems that taxpayers also have some inertia. So this, ladies and gentlemen, is the status quo. This is the inertia. The government, the special interests, and the taxpayers are allowing this giant mass to move at a particular velocity, much like the alcoholic or gambler who doesn't see the need to change until rock bottom is hit, much like the reckless spender who persists in their ways until bankruptcy forces their hand, much like the individual who fails to exercise and subsists on a diet of cheeseburgers and fries, may not change until a heart attack scares them into a different lifestyle. The government and those who allow them to stay in power have an interest in continuing to borrow and continuing to spend at a level greatly exceeding tax income. And what is it that allows this level of deficit spending to persist? Lack of external force, plain and simple. So now the question, and I'll pose this to you. So please give me your thoughts in the comments section. The question is, what is the nature of a possible external force that will upset the status quo? And what will be the impact on the price of gold denominated in Federal Reserve notes? And I'll start to address this in my next video. In the meantime, please give it some thought yourself and let me know what you think. And now it's time for me to get back to work building a replacement picnic table. My old one, it seems, has succumbed to Sir Isaac's law of gravitation.